Good. Starting with a red-listed bird, the starling. I was really delighted to get that photograph. There's a flock of about 1,000 starlings wheeling around, and they were almost all of them young. Well, we've got a long history of bird recording, like most counties in England and indeed Scotland and Wales. And if you look back at our bird report, you'll see it's changed a bit over the years. The top left, you've got the rather basic, very, very quick read. It was probably only about 40 pages long. Moving through the years, a bit more color coming in. And I've just got a comparison of what we did back in 2001. So 2001, bird report was already looking reasonably modern. 249 species seen, 316 observers, 31,000 records. Quite interestingly, 13 color photographs and only one writer who was the editor. Now, the most recent one that came out just literally 3 months ago, the 2022 bird report, 266 species, so we're about the same. But how about this? 2,300 observers and 450,000 records. And this year, we're going to have over 500,000 records. 266 pages and 110 color photos, 20 writers as well. So we now have a very big team, and we turn it around. In fact, we have the bird report written by July of the year following the recording year. So we're really up to date, which is nice. And there we go. There's how it went. I mean, you go back to 1950. It must have been quite nice being county recorder in 1950 because you probably knew every single observer personally. Whereas today, well, I stood down as county recorder last year, and it was quite a job dealing with 2,300 people, of which I would think half probably are really, really new to bird watching. And so quite a lot of the records have errors in them and people get mistaken, of course. So it's quite a tough job being county recorder these days. And I was quite happy to relinquish that post, I can tell you. So how many species do we have? Well, it's 387 in total on the list. The biggest number, of course, being rarities. We have a coast, so we get lots of rarities. And we're pretty close to the continent, so we get quite a few things because of that. But we have 110 residents, 48 winter visitors, 28 summer, 26 passage as well. So it gives you an idea of the makeup of our birding. Now, we've lost quite a few things already. So these were all birds that bred in the county over certainly the first 50 years of the last century, and certainly into the 1970s for some of them, and indeed maybe a bit later. So they've all gone. Dipper, interestingly, returned in 2022. One pair just came back, first time in 20 years, and nested right in the middle of the town of Romsey. And, we were trying to keep it secret, but of course, it's right by a public park, and members of the public were posting photos of it and saying, oh, what's this black and white bird bobbing up and down on a stone in my local river? But these are all birds that we have lost. And of course, that's in common with quite a few other counties who've lost the same species. And yes, black grouse, we had them until the 1920s. Now, I'm not thinking for a moment that black grouse naturally occurred in Hampshire. Some wealthy landowner, I suspect, put them in, and probably to shoot. And they were here with us just over 100 years ago. Would have been amazing to see that, I think. And declining species that we are almost certainly going to lose or nearly lose. And here they are, grey partridge and turtle dove, in common with many places. Wood warbler, well, our wood warblers, I'm going to talk about them later, are really vanishing. Ditto all the others on that list. Although corn bunting, interestingly, we're seeing a revival of corn bunting. It might be in response to some of the activities of farmers putting down supplementary food and so on, but we'll talk about that later. And I was born in 1960, so here are some new arrivals since I arrived, and all of these on this screen are new species to be breeding in Hampshire. Now, some of those are going to be driven by climate change, the egrets, for example, things like Savvy's warbler, Chetty's warbler, no doubt, Mediterranean gull. Interestingly, we've got the only pair of eiders to nest in southern England, and we've got goosanders nesting along the River Avon. So there's quite a lot of interesting things. I'm going to talk about all of these. We'll start with little egret. So we're, like most counties now, have little egrets, but we were one of the first to get them back in 1988 and 89. And they arrived, I think, in a big splurge from France, maybe Spain, 1 year, and they didn't go back. And this is a quick screen grab off British birds, but you can see between 1996 and 2009, the rapid increase from none to 800 breeding pairs in the UK. And of course, it's higher than that, much higher than that now. Looking at the UK from the atlas, of course, you've got them like we have. But in Hampshire, on the left-hand side, you can see the map that Nigel referred to, the Hampshire Breeding Atlas. And you can see they're very much up the river valleys and along the coastal areas. Not a surprise. But actual breeding numbers, less than 100, probably somewhere around 50 to 70. We do get flocks of them. They go to roost, sometimes up to 200 roosting. So we've obviously got a lot of non-breeders or indeed just young birds in amongst our population. And I think we get extra birds coming in every year, probably from the continent, but we can't prove that. It's just my guess. They're nesting in a number of places, about 6 different colonies, most often actually nesting with grey herons and actually using the herons as bodyguards. The herons, of course, nest earlier, and that's a good strategy if you're in your early part of your breeding season as a little egret, because the herons will protect you. But of course, if you're a late breeder, as little egrets are, then when you're really wanting the most help, which is when you've got chicks, that's when the herons are leaving. And there's the nest. And you very often find the nest will go underneath where the grey herons are. So they'll move in literally one layer down. They have the sort of grey herons in the penthouse suite, and then the little egrets are on the floor below, getting the most benefit. But we now also have cattle egrets. So they started nesting about 5 years ago. We've just got one colony of those. Interestingly, they moved in with a colony of little egrets. So there's one place where little egrets nest without herons, or hardly any herons, and the cattle egrets moved in. First of all, cattle egret males were trying to take up with female little egrets, but in the end, they had some female cattle egrets as well. So not many, maybe 5, 6, 7 pairs every year. But we do get flocks of cattle egrets, and here's a flock flying over. Quite extraordinary. We do get influxes from the continent. And I think that's one of the real advantages of being very, very close to France. You know, France is at some places 80 miles away from where we are. And cattle egrets, of course, turning up in many places in southern England now. And here's just a quick screen grab off Bird Guides from a while back, showing you where they've been turning up. So it's very much here to stay, the cattle egret, as indeed is the great white egret. Now, we were lucky to be early with great white egrets. They came, and one particular bird was with us every single year. This is the bird. He was known as Walter, and he had colour rings on his legs. We haven't seen him for a few years now, but we do know he was ringed as a chick in Brittany, in France. He was in the Avon Valley at Blashford Lakes every winter, but disappeared every summer, and nobody saw him at all in the summer. There were no summer records. So I can only think that Walter must have gone back to France, not being in Britain. But we can't prove it because he wasn't seen in France either. Here's a sort of little and large comparison that I like showing to birders, because people say to me, oh, how on earth do I tell the difference between a little egret and a great white egret? Well, apart from the yellow beak on the great white egret during the non-breeding season, just look at the size. And of course, they don't have yellow feet either. Great white egrets all over the place now, up your way, around Hampshire, and indeed in the Midlands. So yeah, definitely a bird to stay. They haven't nested with us yet. They've been seen carrying sticks, but I haven't yet found a nest. So I think it's only a year or two before we will find that. And likewise, I think spoonbills are going to be nesting with us fairly soon. They're already nesting, of course, in England. Our birds, almost all the ones we've managed to track down through colour ringing, are from Holland. And we've got enough around that they could easily set up a colony on one of our coastal reserves, something we are hoping may happen. Here's a group of young ones. We see quite a few, and they're the young ones flying off with their black wingtips. So that's something to look forward to. We don't always enjoy new birds. Here's a one that arrived a few years ago. Of course, when I was a kid, Egyptian geese were only really in Norfolk. I used to go there especially to see them, amazingly. I can't believe that now, but anyway, we did. Here's the BTO atlas on the right, and you can see they spread very much across Norfolk and Suffolk and across from London down through the southern counties. And we have quite a lot in Hampshire. Now, there's our atlas on the left. That's now a bit out of date. So here's a quick bit of data from our recording database. And those are all records of Egyptian goose in Hampshire. So two big population concentrations and rather too many flocks of 200 or so in one or two places. So it's becoming a bit like the Canada goose. It really is. And it's only a matter of time before they spread right across the whole of England, I think. So I mentioned eider duck, and we were really lucky some years ago when a warden went out and he found an eider duck nest without the eggs. Just found it at the end of the breeding season. He'd never seen the birds. He was convinced it was an eider duck nest. And the next year, he did find the nest with eggs. So this is the only nesting pair of eider ducks in southern England. And if you look at this BTO map, you can see the dot just above the Isle of Wight. That is where they nest. So it's extraordinary. I guess this will just stop as soon as that pair, the pair dies. That'll be the end of it. But it's an interesting little thing that happens. Sadly, very few of the chicks ever survive. There are too many other things around attacking them. But the other big discovery about 10 years ago was the arrival of goosander. Now, we have goosander in the winter, of course, but we found goosanders on the River Avon. So that's the river that runs down between Dorset and Hampshire. And they have some wonderful fishing estates there with big fisheries and old trees and things like that. And the goosanders were nesting in there. And there's about 10 pairs now on the River Avon. And again, if you look at the map, you just see down the bottom there to the west of the Isle of Wight, you can see those three dots. That is the population, the breeding population of goosander. So they're in Devon, of course, and that's about it really for southern England apart from us. Not such a surprise for you, but a big surprise for us, and a nice surprise because it's one bird we never thought was going to be breeding with us. Well, we hadn't planned on white-tailed eagles being released, but Roy Dennis was determined that this should happen because he claims that about 250 years ago, white-tailed eagles nested on the Isle of Wight. The data for that's a little bit sketchy. There are some people who argue that maybe they were ospreys, but anyway, it's something which has happened. And since 2019, we've had a release of white-tailed eagles on the Isle of Wight. And here's Roy on the right-hand side, along with the team, just on the release of one of the birds. And forget how many we've got now. I think it's about 15. I'm afraid we've lost a few over the way, with birds being killed, probably intentionally by some people, but also accidentally in a couple of other cases. One, for example, hit a train and so on. But we have about 15 or so of them, and there are now 4 territorial pairs of white-tailed eagles in southern England, 2 in Dorset, 1 sort of sharing itself between the Isle of Wight and Hampshire, haven't made their mind up yet, and another pair in Sussex. And indeed, the Sussex pair reared a chick in 2023, 1 year ahead of expectation because they weren't supposed to breed until this year. Here's the release pens. You've probably seen all of this on the Forestry England website, but it's very well managed. They put them in pairs, couples, so that they actually get to know another bird. They're not just on their own. Then the doors are opened and they're given food whenever they need it, if they want to come back. But of course, quite quickly they head off. And what we found is that they basically, we have trackers on them all. So there's a satellite tracker and there's also a radio tracker on each of them in case the satellite tracker packs up. So we know exactly where these birds have been going. We've got tracks like this for each bird. So here you've got 4 different birds, all of them emanating out from the Isle of Wight and going in different directions. One even went all the way across and around Europe. One of the birds has lost a foot, but still manages to do okay. So they're pretty resilient, and they are very clever because they follow around looking for kites, because if a kite finds food, the white-tailed eagle will be on it soon and grabbing the food, and the kite will lose out. So they are quite smart. And about half of them feed on fields, feeding on things like dead pheasants, dead rabbits, and the others are coastal feeders. So they're mainly feeding on fish, grey mullet, things like that, grabbing them out of the water, or indeed eating dead fish on the shoreline. Indeed, unfortunately, one of them found a dead porpoise, and that was probably not its best move because it itself died about a week later. Well, I mentioned kites. We have lots now. So back in the time when they were released initially in the Chilterns, we ended up with a few within a few years, but we now have in Hampshire about 500 pairs of red kites. And of course, you'll be very familiar with the story from Wales, where back in the 60s and 70s, at the BTO's first atlas, that was the picture. And of course, the most recent atlas, quite an old atlas now, we're going to be doing another one in 3 years' time. That was the story as the birds had started to spread. Now, this is my story in Hampshire. Is the Isle of Wight is not in our recording area, although they hardly have any kites. They don't particularly like flying over water. But you can see the real intensity is in the north of the county there. But that's quite an old map now, so it'll be much more intense than that. And we do surveys every winter. We have roosts. So that was 2022. We had 423 in roosts. We've just done it again, and I think we had something like 550. So these are winter roosts of primarily young red kites, but also some unmated birds in amongst them. Now, one of the things I did notice is that during lockdown, they really struggled because where we are, they primarily are feeding on roadkill, and they're very early on the case. They're up every morning as soon as it's light, searching the roads for dead rabbits and things like that. And of course, there were no cars during the lockdown periods, and so red kites had no roadkill. I think squirrels were sort of playing in the middle of the motorways. So they really did decline. And we noticed for the couple of years after lockdown that the dent in the population has had to build itself up again. Goshawks, well, we've got plenty of those. We now have in Hampshire an estimated 150, possibly as many as 180 pairs of goshawks, 45 pairs in the New Forest alone. And that's quite impressive because the first pair arrived in 2001. So it's really taken off. They're in any kind of bit of conifer within deciduous woodland, or indeed coniferous woods themselves if they're not too thick. Well, you have plenty of goshawks too, and you can see our population there down in the bottom. And in the map on the left, you can see the real concentration for the New Forest. But again, that map is a bit out of date. I again got the data, had a look, and this is every single 10-kilometre square that we cover, and it indicates which 10-kilometre squares have had goshawks in the last year. And you can see it's almost every single square. So they really are moving in. Goshawks used to be quite a big story for us. Now people don't really say very much about it, not because they're being secretive, but because it's an everyday experience almost to see a goshawk if you go to the right habitat. But that doesn't mean they're any less impressive. That wonderful white on the underside, fanning out as they fly around, really superb, particularly doing display. And they will have been displaying today because it's been a beautiful sunny day here. And plenty of nests. We've had, quite often up to 3 nests for each pair, and they are massive. You could literally sit in a goshawk nest without any trouble at all. Well, people talk about Hampshire in relation to honey buzzards, but, that's not so much the case these days. And honey buzzards are very widespread. You've got them in Wales. They're in many different English counties now. And for example, next door to us in Sussex, they decided to make a bit of an effort to find honey buzzards, and they found 20 territories last year. We actually didn't do as well. We probably had something between 5 and 10 territories. They're a difficult bird to survey. You've got to have decent people who know what they're doing, and they're also going to put the time in and don't mind sitting on the top of a hill, staring into the distance to see what they can find. So here's a male honey buzzard with its very grey head, a slightly sort of smaller plumage than the female. there's that map for the BTO showing no detail at all, but at least you can see the intensity down in the south between Hampshire and Sussex, where there are a lot. This is a place called Acres Down, which is the best place in the New Forest to sit if you want to see honey buzzards. And if you come to Hampshire, I do recommend time in the New Forest. It's the best place. We have 15 million visitors a year, but you can find places like this where you won't see anybody all day. We do find that people struggle with identifying buzzard and honey buzzard. So the buzzard's on the left, honey buzzard on the right. They're not even related, these two species. And of course, the daft thing, honey buzzard isn't a buzzard and it doesn't eat honey. But it's a very distinctive looking bird, almost like a pigeon sort of head. And here's a buzzard, a couple of buzzards flying very clearly, sort of short, stocky wings, not a particularly long tail. I wonder how many honey buzzards you can see in this photo. The answer is 5. Every single one of those is a honey buzzard. They're extremely variable. Some of them are very pale. Some of them are really dark. Almost all of the ones I think in here, I think all of them are in fact young birds, where they have dark eyes. The young bird, there's an adult with a very obviously orange eye. When you look at it really closely, have a look at the nostril in the notch in the top of the beak, and you can see there that it's the shape of a letterbox. So if you're a bird that's going to spend your day digging around wasp nests and getting them out of the ground, the last thing you really want to have is a nose that can allow wasps to crawl in. So it's got a very tightly closed nose. And that's obvious actually when they're babies too. Here's a young one. So as a young bird, a honey buzzard has dark eyes, and it's been suggested that maybe this is to make it look like a common buzzard so that other birds don't attack it. Don't know if that's true or not, but that's what a honey buzzard looks like as a chick. Quite confusing, and indeed, when they are pale forms, even more confusing. So this is a young honey buzzard as well. But one thing that's very distinctive and you can't mistake is the display. So here's a honey buzzard doing its flapping display where it basically drops down, but it's got its wings above its head. They always do that when they can see another honey buzzard. I've never seen them do it just on their own. I've only ever seen it when there's been at least 2 honey buzzards in the sky. And they will do that right through the breeding season, not just when they first arrive. You can see it in August, even when they're actually still trying to feed chicks in the nest. And here is a chick in the nest. You can see already the shape of the nostril is that little flat piece. And around this chick, you can see in the nest there bits of wasp comb. So it's wasp comb they're after. That's the main thing. Here's the male and female. So Steve Roberts from Wales comes down and he puts cameras up at our nests just for a few hours to see what we can see. And there's the male at the top, female below. Female's much bigger and much darker. And you'll see this particular female, she has got a plastic ring which says AJ. And AJ was quite notorious. She was born in Sussex, came to us. Then she went from Sussex to Hampshire, and then to Surrey, then back to Hampshire. And at the time when we last saw her, she was the oldest honey buzzard ever known. So an impressive bird. And as I say, they spend their time digging out wasps. Wasp comb is what they're after. Several different species of wasp. They'll go for all of them, I think. But the other thing that they will feed on, which was a bit of a surprise when the early work was done by Steve and others, was that they actually eat an awful lot of frogs. And they find these frogs on the ground when they're walking around. They've got very flat feet like chickens, and they walk around on the floor of the wood, and that's when they find frogs. And they bring the frogs back for the chicks. So it could be that actually, in terms of the amount of food, frogs may well be the main item that baby honey buzzards feed on. There's some work to be done still on that, I think, to formalize it. Well, you've got peregrines. We've got them too. Ours primarily are nesting on buildings, and we didn't have them until 1993, and that's when the very first pair arrived. So here's the BTO Atlas when I was a boy. No peregrines at all down our way. Plenty up your way, but none with us. And of course, when the change map is looked at for the first atlas versus the third atlas, you can see the big change. All these upright triangles are indeed places that they've moved into. And locally in southern England, this is the change. So the birds started nesting in all the counties on the left-hand side in these dates. And in most cases, they had never nested before. So they'd never nested in Hampshire. They had nested, of course, in Sussex and Dorset because they were coastal with cliffs. So we don't have any cliffs in Hampshire. So places like Oxfordshire and Wiltshire, London and Essex, they were moving in and they started nesting on buildings, which is superb. And I run the Peregrine project in Hampshire, and this is where we started in 1993 with one pair on the left-hand end. It's not quite up to date, this map, but it's almost identical numbers because in 2022 and 2023 there were about 20 birds nesting, 20 pairs. So it's probably at saturation level now. And we've got some coastal nests primarily. So the left-hand map is showing you the distribution in summer. So you can see most of those birds are on the coast or near the rivers. The right-hand map is showing you the winter distribution. And of course, then they've got non-breeding birds that move away from the coast, but we also have an awful lot of Scandinavian peregrines that come and join us from Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Indeed, of all the records of overseas peregrines being seen in Britain, 85% of those came from Scandinavia. This is a wonderful peregrine called Winnie. Winnie has been our peregrine in Winchester on the cathedral for the last 6 years. And very sadly, she died last week. But you know, peregrines are amazing. She was killed by another female who came in and took over her territory and took over her nest site and her male. So we've got the sad news that we've lost our lovely Winnie, but we've got a brand new peregrine. And Winnie was at least 15 years old, so I guess wasn't going to be breeding for too many more years. And there she is with her former partner, Chester. And we have cameras. If you ever want to have a look at yet another peregrine camera, we've got a fantastic camera at Winchester, which allows us to see everything going on and the feeding of chicks and so on. And they're brilliant parents, peregrines, getting rid of buzzards. We've had buzzards brought down, kites brought down. They really are very, very good indeed. They nest on a really large variety of sites. So this is probably the only mobile peregrine nest in the country because this is on a crane and this crane is on a railway line. So the yellow bit at the bottom is a train and the grey bit is the crane, of course. And there are about 9 of these in a line and they go up and down the railway line to meet wherever the ships have docked and they offload all the various bits of cargo and whatever. And the peregrines nest on the crane. So when I have to send in my BTO form, you know what the BTO's like, they always want something very precise. They want a 6-brick grid reference, and I have to give them a range of about 6 different references, which always annoys them. But even more amazing was this. This is a floating crane. This is called Canute, and Canute was based at that time in Southampton, and it would sail to wherever the heavy lifting job was required, usually only just a few hundred yards from wherever it mainly moored. But in 2004, it had to go all the way to the Isle of Wight to do a lifting job and then come all the way back. But on that occasion, a pair of peregrines had already started nesting at the very top of that crane. So the female peregrine went with the crane all the way down over a couple of days to the Isle of Wight. They did the heavy lifting job in Cowes, turned around, came back. The male was still in Southampton, he never left, but the female was still on the crane as it came back, and they did hatch out their chicks. And I think it does show a degree of desperation that in the Isle of Wight bird report that year, they reported having nesting peregrines for 2 days, which I think is pretty cheeky. Well, we're lucky to have a lot of hobbies. I don't know about you, but I think it's just the supreme flying falcon, such a wonderful outline. We've probably got about 175 pairs of hobbies in Hampshire, which is really superb. It's obviously a much more widespread species than many people realize. They're so good at hiding. They don't make much noise. And, you know, you'd be surprised just how many there are. And here's the distribution map in Hampshire. So you can see again that the New Forest down in the southwest is an area where there's a big concentration of hobbies, but it's also where the biggest concentration is of goshawks. And there is, for sure, interaction between goshawk and hobby. We had a camera on a hobby nest, and a goshawk came along and ate all the chicks, which was pretty devastating. And it was particularly devastating because there was a school group watching the camera at the time, and I think most of them have to be sent off to be given sedation after that. But anyway, here's the decline in the hobby according to our last atlas. Now, this has been hugely underrecorded. There are many more hobbies than that. We know that for sure. But you can see all the red squares are places where hobbies have disappeared from, and the green ones are where they've moved in. So you might wonder why I think there's 175 pairs. Well, I can't be sure, but they are definitely doing very well away from the New Forest. And within the New Forest, what we've now found is that they generally don't nest near to goshawks. The ones that used to nest near to goshawks never succeeded. So they've learned now to be out on the open forest, on the heathland, maybe in an isolated pine tree, or elsewhere in Hampshire in isolated trees in farmland. But it's just hugely underrecorded. So we do have a lot of them. And there's one catching a dragonfly. We get both the adults and, of course, the young birds from the previous year come back as well sometimes. So we get a real mixture of adults and first-year birds. And here's a typical example of a hobby nest now in a tree like this. The ringer is up in the tree already, getting the chicks. We have a lot of nests put up now. So these are fake nests. They're just literally a load of twigs, large twigs strung together with rope and whatever, and they go for that very, very quickly. And indeed, things like flower baskets, they'll nest in those as well. And here are the chicks, just about to be ringed. Well, one of my favourite birds is the stone curlew, and the RSPB has a stone curlew project in Hampshire, as well as other parts where they're found, and I'm very pleased to be part of that team. This is the UK distribution of stone curlew. So if you ever come down this way, this is a bird you really must look for, although they're tricky because they don't nest anywhere where you can see them. So the way to do that is to go to the RSPB reserve at Normanton Down, just inside Wiltshire, where they've got hides and you can see them well. Excuse me. But you can see here, the population is basically on Wiltshire and also up in Norfolk and Suffolk, going across to Hampshire as well. In Hampshire, they're right up in the north. They're on the chalk, on the downs. As Nigel said, that's the top end as we go into... don't lose my voice here. Hang on. Excuse me. Right. Now, here's the change map where you can see how numbers have gone over the last few years. So in red, you can see where the range has got smaller, green where it's got larger. So these are mapped centrally to avoid individual locations to be shown. But you can see that they really are now concentrating on just a few areas. And that's where we've created plots for them, so they can nest on farms without any problems. It's a very wary bird. It never likes to be anywhere where it can see people. If they see people more than once a day, they'll move off. And the nest is really well hidden. Here's a nice chalk slope, and you can just see the nest there below. And here's a typical plot where we put got the farmer to not put crop in that area, and they've gone through, they've cultivated the land, put a grass buffer down the middle, which is quite helpful for the birds to hide their chicks in. And that's really a good way of doing it. That's what it'll look like close up. They always want stony ground. They don't nest on clay soils, they only nest on chalk. But it's a real challenge for us because not all the birds nest on the plots that we create for them. And sometimes they just nest on farms randomly. And here's a good example where we've had to talk to the farmer. And in this case, maybe the farmer will just divert the tractor a little bit. Or maybe we'll take the eggs and remove them so that the birds can have their nest put back down again once the tractor's passed. There's the eggs, by the way. And in that sort of situation, it's very important to know when the eggs are going to hatch. And the way we find that out is by measuring the egg. So we know the volume, and then the weight of the egg will reduce every day as the yolk is used up by the growing chick inside. So by measuring and weighing, we'll know how many days before that bird is going to hatch out. And by looking at that, we can tell the farmer, for example, you've got 5 days before your chicks are going to hatch out. If you watch Spring Watch, I did that with Chris Packham on one of our fields back in 2021, I think. And we also have farms where, of course, the chicks just hatch out anyway. And here's a good example. The chicks are just in front of the farmer there. And, if we didn't remove those, they would be killed by the tractor. So by going and working with farmers, we've managed to really increase our population of stone curlews terrifically. They hide really well. They're not easy to find. I can barely find them. So it usually means we have to work as teams to find the birds and then ring the chick. We don't ring them currently. We may do it again, but we've run out of colour combinations. There were 5,000 combinations, so we've done well, and we may have to start again. And here are a couple of chicks that we rescued from a field where the rape was being harvested, and we got the chicks out as the tractor arrived, a combine harvester, put them in the back of my car, and kept them safe. And here's a little thank you from the stone curlew chick for all our efforts. Chris Packham, I think, would have been extremely jealous of that because he's very keen on things like that. But there's the bird with its rings. And it's great to see them in flocks. There's a flock of stone curlews on a field with some lapwings. And we have flocks of 70 or so. So if you do head down this way, that's a bird you really should try and find because you're not going to find it in many places in England. And there they are flying around together. Pretty sure they go off as family groups in the autumn. Well, avocets, of course, are much more widespread now than they used to be, but we've only got them nesting in the last 10 years or so. And you can see that they're in our part of the world, we have most of the avocets. Now, I love that photo, not my photo, but lots of legs there underneath that bird. I put great black-backed gull on because it's one of the major threats to breeding avocet. They come along and systematically take all the chicks one by one, or if they can get them, they'll take the eggs. So that's one of the main threats. But the other main threat now is otter. And we have a growing population of otters. And so we do have to now fence our avocet colonies in order to stop them from being attacked by the otters. We can't get rid of the black-headed, the great black-backed gulls, but at least the otters can't get to them now. Well, talking about the gulls, one that we do have a lot of, and indeed they are expanding across the whole of the UK now, and Scotland and elsewhere, a few breeding records now, the Mediterranean gull. Well, you can see in the south there, we have them nesting in Sussex and also in Dorset, but we've got a huge number in Hampshire. We had the very first pair in 1966. One pair, we'd had a few mixed pairs with black-headed gulls before that, but when they arrived in big numbers. And so here's a colony of Mediterranean gulls, and we have one colony in particular now, which is 1,700 pairs, which is massive, absolutely massive for a bird that was not even a breeding species when I was born. Here's the map just showing the numbers from up until 2018. I could add a few more probably. It's about the same now, but you can see how it grew really, really steep. And one of the interesting things is they don't generally feed very much around the coast. They actually go inland in big numbers to feed on local farms, particularly when there's a farmer going around with a tractor, or maybe when there's an insect emergence of ants and things like that. This is a day when we saw loads of flying ants and the fields were just covered in Mediterranean gulls. And we see plenty of ringed birds from places up at Poland and France, Germany. Quite a lot of the birds we see are colour ringed. So there's quite an activity going around logging all of those now. Well, Chetty's warbler arrived in Britain via Hampshire. We had the first birds in the 1960s. It was all a bit confusing as to what they were back then. I think people thought it was a moustached warbler, but it isn't. Of course, it's Chetty's warbler, and a familiar bird now in many, many places. We've probably got about 400 pairs now. And you can see how much they've spread. But in Hampshire, just look at that map on the left, and it reveals where they are. They're all on the valleys, the river valleys. So the Avon Valley on the left, the Test Valley going across up the middle, and then the Itchin. So they really do like river valleys. They also nest in some of our coastal marshes too. We're just getting ringneck parakeet. We haven't had them. There's loads in London, of course. London, thousands of ringneck parakeets. We now have probably about 20 or so around Southampton. So there's the distribution. You can see the huge number in London, but there aren't really any between London and Southampton. So it's a kind of all or nothing bird. They don't like being on their own, but once a few of them get together, that's what happens. And you can see around Southampton, this concentration now as the birds are building up their population. Raven is a bird that I wouldn't have seen in Hampshire when I first moved here in 1989, but now we've got at least 80 pairs. They're nesting on man-made structures, primarily islands and things like that, and pine trees. So they've come across from the west, and they're now actually just on the outskirts of London. So it's amazing. I don't know what happened to make the raven suddenly so much more common, but exactly the same thing happened in North America. And you can see what a westerly distribution it was. And indeed, when the next atlas map comes out, you'll see that that line will have moved even further east as they just keep on moving. Grey partridge, well, we've lost them in almost all of our farms now. Just a few farms have them. There are, of course, releases being done, but the ones where they do well, the farmers have to farm very carefully for them with beetle banks and special kinds of, hedgerow for the grey partridge to get the numbers up. It's quite a complicated species. Just look on the left-hand side at that top map, the change map for Hampshire. Just shows all that red, how they have disappeared from so many areas, and they're just in a few farms now. Not a lot we can do because I don't think farmers have the time to manage their land. They probably can get the money from government, but it does take time and dedication to farm for grey partridge. And similarly, I think, the turtle dove is going for all of us, isn't it? We have now 3 sites only with turtle dove, and yet it used to be across the whole county. Again, what a disappointing map, that top left-hand one. Lost from 468 tetrads between the surveys. So devastating. They do struggle everywhere. They struggle probably to find decent cover in Africa. A lot of them winter in Senegal and places like that, where a lot of the country is now very, very dry, and there are a lot of goats and things like that feeding on the open areas. And wood warbler, another bird that I'm afraid we're going to lose. We've got about 5 pairs of wood warblers now. We used to have, well over 100. They're all in the New Forest. The signs for that are perhaps that this is down to climate change, that the wood warbler relies very much on things like caterpillars, small caterpillars from moths. And these caterpillars have advanced their life cycle or their breeding cycle so that they actually are now moths by the time that wood warblers need them to be caterpillars. The only way that could change is if the wood warbler was able to advance its own breeding season. And I don't think it's going to do that in time. So again, here's the map. Now, as I said, these atlas maps are quite old now. And if I did that change map in Hampshire, it would be red almost entirely, with about probably only 3 squares that weren't red. And similarly, the willow tit. It's a bird we have lost now in Hampshire. This is, again, I think, driven by climate change. We have great woodlands, lots of coppice, very good suitable habitat. But look, here's the national map showing change. So you can see there all the black downward triangles are disappearing willow tits, yet they are moving further north, and certainly the populations in the Midlands and further north are much stronger than they ever were before. So it's a bird that we now actually have lost since these maps were made. And I don't think we should be surprised, because the climatic atlas was the atlas that told us what would happen with climate change. So the way that worked is it took the distribution of birds at the time when the book was published about 15 years ago, and it then predicted what the population distribution would be just entirely based on temperature in 100 years' time. So here's what they say was the current population as of about 15 years ago, and here's what they predicted it was going to be. So you can see they predicted that the birds were going to leave southern England, and they did. So if I just switch between those two a few times, you can see how the population of willow tit was predicted to change, and indeed it has. A lesser redpoll, it's a bird. We've only actually had one breeding record now in the last 20 years. It's such a disappointment. It's a bird we see in the winter, but we don't have them breeding at all. And you can see how thin they are in southern England as a breeding species. So you're lucky to have them breeding in your local woodlands and in the hills, but we just don't have them anymore. And again, I suspect that probably is going to be linked to climate change, maybe. Can't prove it. And corn bunting, well, it is a good story, because corn bunting's almost disappeared from many areas, but they are coming back and coming back well. So there's the distribution of corn bunting. You can see the strength of all the numbers there, particularly with the chalk. Look at the Hampshire map, you can see lots of red, but I can tell you that when we do the survey again, a lot of areas of green will appear. And there are reasons for that, because farmers are putting out supplementary food. Some farmers also are now leaving double densities of crop in the middle of fields, which is attractive to corn buntings, and it means they go to nest in the middle of the field rather than the edge of the field, and that means they're away from predators, so their breeding success is much higher than if they were on the edges of fields. And firecrest, well, a real success story for us. The first pair of firecrests nested in Hampshire in the early 1960s, and that was in the New Forest. It was a real secret back then as to where they were nesting. I put this slide in and put at least 2,000 pairs now in Hampshire, but it's probably more like 4,000 pairs. You can walk through any bit of woodland in Hampshire and hear firecrests, and it's not a bird you even bother to write down though. They're probably as common, if not commoner, than goldcrests in some of our woods. This map shows the distribution back at the time of the last atlas. Well, when we redo that, it's going to be a much bigger and much more dense map, and that'll be true also for the rest of of England and indeed elsewhere. More of them in Wales as well. So a good bird to see if you come down. And indeed, I know you've got hawfinches. Well, we've got between 450 and 550 pairs, almost all of them in the New Forest, and that's a really pleasing story. We've got them. We've got something like 35 to 40 winter roosts, and many of those roosts are also used right throughout the year. And there's the distribution. You can see again the southwest area, the New Forest being the centre of all of that. So that's a really good success story. We've got more than anybody else. And we've also got more lesser spotted woodpeckers than anybody else. And the 250 pairs, almost all of those again in the New Forest. And I'm going to be recording a piece for the BBC One show next week. So look out for that, a piece with Mike Dilger looking at lesser spotted woodpeckers in the New Forest. So there's the distribution, thin distribution across most of England. But when you look at Hampshire, again, look at that population down in the New Forest. It's very, very dense indeed. And I think the key thing here is that they're so dense down there that, as birds die, new ones can move in. Whereas in areas elsewhere in the north of the county, just odd pairs, when one of them dies, the nearest available spare bird maybe many, many miles away, and they may never actually meet. So that's why the New Forest does so well. And Dartford warbler. Well, this is slightly pessimistic, 600 to 800 pairs. It's probably closer to 1,000 pairs right now. We've had some mild winters and the birds are doing very well in summer. 2 broods, lots of chicks. And if you look here, here's the national situation with the birds moving into lots of new areas and indeed moving up through bits of England. And in Hampshire, a really dense number in the New Forest. I'd really recommend you think about maybe a club visit down to the New Forest, maybe for a couple of days, 3 days in June or something one year. Be a good thing to do. See lots of birds. So what's going to happen next? Well, in no particular order, but I suspect first being great white egret. All of these may well nest soon. Great white egret's already here. It's here with us all year. We just haven't found them nesting yet. Betton, well, we've had them booming at 2 different locations in recent years. Will that happen? I suspect it will, because the Betton population of Britain, of course, is at a very high level. And cranes and white stork, well, both have been released in southern England, the cranes down around Slimbridge and Somerset, and the white storks at Knepp in Sussex. So although not totally natural, I think we will get them. Well, I've got a few friends who helped me with photographs for that talk, but many of them also are my photographs, and I'd be very happy to take any questions. So Nigel, I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll hand back to you.
Well, many, many thanks, Keith. That was wonderful. So much information to entertain us this evening and inform us. I mean, it was wonderful. I'm sure that there will be a few questions if you can cope. I know your voice has been.
No, I'm okay now.
But yeah, if we could take you up on that, please. Any questions to Keith, either by Gary or just straight out?
We have one in the chat already, actually, which is, are the ruddy duck declining due to deliberate culling?
Yes, yeah, the ruddy ducks were shot by people employed by DEFRA, and indeed, every time anybody put a report of a ruddy duck up, about 2 days later, the shooters would be down there to shoot them. So they've all gone.
All right, they've all gone.
Sorry, I couldn't hear your question, or was that a comment?
I think it was a comment.
Oh, comment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, there was a big case made for getting rid of ruddy ducks because of the white-headed duck in Spain. How true that real threat was, I don't know. Most people you ask about it, they're not on the fence. They're either very against them or very in favor. I haven't got a view particularly.
Keith, are there any moves to control numbers of Egyptian geese and other feral waterfowl?
None yet. So let's start with Egyptian goose. There's no attempt, as far as I know, to get rid of Egyptian geese. But I imagine that people probably will start pricking eggs and things like that because they're not very popular. I mean, they're quite pretty birds, but they are noisy and they make a lot of mess. There are attempts to definitely get the numbers of Canada geese down. People do shoot them and eggs are pricked and taken and so on. But the numbers are huge.
Thank you. Any questions? Any further questions for Keith?
I see Julian's comment about firecrests. Well, I'll give you an example of how many we've got. We did a marsh tit survey last spring, March, and I went out and I would walk. I'd stop at a point and I'd look for marsh tits using playback. I'd then walk 200 meters to the next spot and do that again. And in between, I'd noticed there'd be at least 2, if not 3, firecrest territories. So I started noting the firecrest territories. And in the end, I had 35 marsh tit territories and 70 firecrest territories across 3 woods. So they're just everywhere.
That is very impressive. Any further questions?
Yes, please, Keith. Yeah,
Hi,
thanks for the talk. It was fantastic. Thank you. I'm not sure if I missed it, but is there any conflict between goshawks and honey buzzards in the New Forest?
Goshawks and honey buzzards has certainly been rumoured to be something that should be a problem, but it's not something we've detected at all. And if actually we've detected anything, we've noticed other honey buzzards being problems for honey buzzards. So we had a sort of rogue couple of female honey buzzards, bizarre. The two females who spent the whole summer going around together, and they just seemed to go around and upset all the other honey buzzards that were nesting. So they'd go around and distract all the other honey buzzards and result in birds leaving the nest and fighting them off and whatever. There may well be impact from goshawks, but I suspect actually the timing of the honey buzzard nesting season may be the secret here. So honey buzzards nest really late. They have their chicks in July and August, and the goshawks nest early. The goshawks are looking for lots of food by the early part, well, sort of June, late May. And I think probably the goshawk main season when they're looking for lots of food has sort of passed. I mean, of course, there's lots of young birds around, but they're probably busy chasing other stuff and not worrying about honey buzzards.
Okay, thank you.
They definitely have an impact on hobbies, though. And I think what they do with hobbies is they just force the hobbies to live somewhere else. So it's a bit like having a drug dealer living in your street and everybody moves away, and goes to live somewhere else where there aren't drug dealers.
Yeah, yeah. Good analogy.
Yeah.
Oh, could I also mention about hawfinches? You said you got a
Yeah.
good population there. We've got like a smallish population in North Wales, and we do occasionally get birds that probably breed in Scandinavia, like Sweden. I think ringing recoveries have shown that. Do you get any birds? Do you get an influx in winter at all from continental birds?
We do, yeah, definitely. We definitely get some. I don't know about ringing recoveries. We've done a lot of ringing of our own birds. I think we've had a couple, but not many foreign recoveries. We've certainly had birds that have been judged to be foreign based on the size of the bird. But our own work has been done on actually tracking them. So we've put little trackers on them, geolocator trackers, so which are on the bird for about 2 weeks. They then fall off. And the way it works is you put the tracker on the bird, and you also put a tracker on the tracker, so that when the tracker falls off after 2 weeks, you then go around and you find the tracker that's fallen off using a radio receiver, and then you're able to download the data. And we found all the areas where hawfinches like to feed in the New Forest, and we found, for example, particular batches of holly that they like to feed in. And the result of that is it's been possible to give Forestry England some guidance as to which areas of habitat are worth keeping really intact. For example, they issue licenses to people to cut holly, and we've been able to encourage them to not give license for certain areas where we know the hawfinches are really in there feeding.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Okay, we have a couple of other questions, some comments. We've got a great talk with some good news for some birds from Sue. Barbara's asking, I believe that bustards have been reintroduced in a neighbouring county. Has that been successful, and are they spreading?
So the Bustard Project is the Great Bustard Project on Salisbury Plain. It's in Wiltshire. It had a rocky start, didn't have an easy time initially, but I think it has gone quite well now. And there are several pairs breeding, and those birds do fly around. They fly to neighbouring counties, for example, Dorset. I don't know a lot about it, if I'm honest. I don't really think it's going to be one of those things where the population becomes particularly viable because they keep bringing in new stock. So I don't know as much about it as I probably should. And the truth is, if it was in Hampshire, I would. So I'll have a read up on that.
Okay, and sorry.
Somebody asking about the trackers. Who pays for the trackers? Well, Hampshire Ornithological Society paid for quite a lot of those trackers. We're very fortunate. We have a bank balance at the moment in the region of £120,000, partly because we bid for and won commercial contract work where we send out our members to survey things. And that's brought in something like 50 or 60,000 over the last 5 years. So yeah, we fund those.
You can probably see the answer that says, wow.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
I did see that, yeah. Well, it's very interesting running a bird club because you've obviously got to have enough money to cover the cost of membership, printing the bulletin, sending it out, printing the bird report. We charge £16 to be a member, which just about covers the cost. I mean, it costs £16 to service people. But we probably make a very slight loss on that. So if actually an extra 1,000 people joined us, we'd probably be bankrupted. So we've got to think very carefully. I can see the person saying, I'm thinking of Bardsey. We're not going to fund projects outside of Hampshire, I'm afraid. But maybe somebody else will, Welsh Ornithological Society or something, will fund anything in Hampshire.
Keith, can you just say a little bit more about the undoubted success of the Hampshire Ornithological Society, upon which so much of tonight's talk's been based? It sounds quite remarkable.
We are very lucky. We've got a very strong society. We've always been quite strong, but we've particularly gone through a period of growth in the last sort of 5 years or so. A good example is that one of our young members, we only had 2 young members who are teenagers. One of them came to me and said, can I do anything to help? And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, well, I'll do anything. I said, well, can you find more people who are your age? Because we really need them. And I said, and here's the deal, we'll make it free. We don't want to take money off young people. Because at the time we were charging £5, which was not very much. But honestly, if all you're going to charge is £5, why not make it free? So we stopped charging them. And we've now got 80 young members. So we've got more young members than probably any bird club other than, I know Sheffield's got quite a lot, but we've probably got more than anybody. We do a lot of events for them. We do about 12 events, ringing events. We do masterclasses on how to get a good career in conservation, working with the BTO and RSPB, and lots of them want to work in the environment. We got an artist in to help them how to draw and paint birds. We're going to run things like photographic masterclasses. We introduce them to ringing. And we cover young people who are both living in Hampshire and people who are from Hampshire who've gone elsewhere. So if somebody went to Bangor to the university, we would support them from Hampshire all the way through that time. And likewise, if they came from Bangor to us, we'd support them. We also were one of the first clubs to have a female WhatsApp group. And this is simply because there are many women who are members, but they don't turn up very often. And when you actually ask them why they don't turn up very often, you find they were the only woman on the outing. And it wasn't a problem, but they didn't feel like it was a lot of fun. So by putting a WhatsApp group together and putting many of our female members onto it, it means that they can say, look, there's an outing on Saturday, I'm going, anybody else want to come? And the next thing is 5 of them say, right, we'll all go as well. And it's increased the involvement of our female members in our events. It's actually increased our female membership as well. So it's actually a 5% increase in female membership over the last couple of years. And we now have about 100 women in the WhatsApp group. So it's good because it means they can do their own trips as well. Somebody said to me, shall we do some female-only outings? And I said, well, I don't really think that's very fair. You wouldn't want it if I did male-only outings, would you? So they do their own trips where if they just want to go away and go somewhere, they can announce it and people join up with them. Yeah, well, we're lucky. Things are going well for us, but it like all clubs, it's hard to find people to do work. It's hard to recruit people to be trustees and volunteers. And I spend most of my time as chair finding people to do jobs because that's the toughest thing at the moment in all bird clubs.
Well, thank you for that overview, that honest overview, Keith. I think as you were talking, a couple more questions came in. Osprey platforms.
Osprey platforms. So ospreys, we have about 5 osprey platforms, none of which are used. And they may well be used in the future because, of course, they are nesting in Poole Harbour, just over the border in Dorset. Yep. They were put there and they are having chicks. So those chicks will think, hopefully, of Dorset or Hampshire as their home. And there's a good chance the osprey will nest in the next 10 years, maybe not in the next 5 years, but 10 years perhaps. Keyhaven Marshes, you went to see first little egrets in the 1980s. So did I. I remember that really well. It was quite exciting, wasn't it? Because they were rare. I remember the very first one. I remember driving, exceeding the speed limit to get down there to see it, which seems a bit daft now. But how are species like cuckoo doing in Hampshire? Yeah, Colin, of course, the famous Colin the cuckoo from Surrey.
Mm.
We have quite a few cuckoos in the New Forest. I don't know what the numbers are like. It's very, very hard to survey cuckoos because they overlap so much and territories are huge. We had a tracker on it, which was called Selborne, and Selborne came back for 3 summers. And, sometimes he was in the New Forest, sometimes he was on the Isle of Wight. We had no idea their territories were so big. But I think they're doing okay. They're not doing too well in northern Hampshire, but they're doing well in the south.
And Keith, may I ask about woodcock? Because woodcock as a breeding bird is just disappearing, certainly in North and Mid Wales.
Yeah, same here. We have very few woodcock compared to days before, but we do have plenty in winter. But of course, those are immigrants from Russia, and that's one of the reasons why many of us are pushing very hard that woodcock should not be shot until December. Because if you shoot a woodcock in October or November, you may well shoot a British one. Chances are, if you shoot one in December, it might be Russian.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, time for one last question, anybody? Or are we done?
Well, if you do come down, if you do decide to do a kind of group weekend away, I will happily advise you. If I'm around, I'll try and join you for some of it. It's a good county. I think it's got good birding, and actually, I have to say the birders are friendly, which is nice. It's not always the case in some counties, but they're very friendly in Hampshire.
Well, that's a fantastic invitation, which I hope we'll either take up as a group or as individuals. Keith, thank you ever so much. It's been a combination to really whet the appetite tonight. I mean, exemplary talk. Congratulations about a fabulous county, and just some inspiring stories about the birds, most happily increasing, with some remarkable facts and figures, and a really quite definite timeline about it, which is fascinating. Always good to see those sort of hard dates and timings of events coming through, and in some cases, very good ideas for the reasons why there's been increases, and in a negative sense, some of the declines too. It was all really so interesting to compare with our local experiences here in Northwest Wales, and some comparable changes and others not so. So really fascinating to find that.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I've got one quick question for you, actually, and that is that I've got a couple of friends from America who are coming across, who I've done birding with in the States, and they're coming across to Hampshire at the last week of May, and they've decided to go to Ireland via Holyhead. So they're going to come to Anglesey for a couple of nights, and they would like to look at things like, the seabirds at South Stack and so on. They won't know where to go. If there's anybody on your group who could maybe just help them out, show them around for a day or even half a day, just do let me know via Nigel, because it would be great just to help them out.
We'd be very happy.
I could do that.
Yes.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate that.
Treasures up our sleeve here as well.
Good. And I saw there was a question from JK saying, how are campaigning opportunities down there? Campaigning, well, we campaign against a lot of things. We lose loads, I'm afraid, because, of course, government housing targets are so high that there's house building everywhere around here at the moment, and it's quite appalling. But when we do campaign on big things, we seem to do well. So we've campaigned with RSPB and other organisations on a number of major land grabs that we thought were wrong, and we've won in recent cases. But I tell you what, it's very, very hard. And as a local organisation, as a club, it's very hard for us. So we rely on people like the RSPB to do that. But, it's a constant struggle. Absolutely.
But you have shown with a number of examples, though, the power of your society and the benefits that those targeted surveys and conservation efforts can have. I'm very impressed. And the stone curlew work's fantastic. If I can comment on a personal experience in Hampshire, probably my highlight of last year was seeing my first ever lesser spotted woodpecker nest, courtesy of Nigel Matthews, who we were
Right.
mentioning before your talk this evening. And he showed it me growing in a wet alder woodland. And he said, right, you just have to know the habitat and then you know exactly where to look. And he was absolutely right, because we found a few more pairs after that. But, you know, that sort of targeted knowledge reaps so much benefit, and you've shown it this evening. And I really hope that your appearance with Mike Dilger, who is one of our former Bangor Bird Group members,
I know.
next week for the Bourne show, please pass on our regards to him when you are out there in the field. I hope that, you know, highlights and brings to the fore lesser spotted woodpecker nationwide. Well done on that effort. It's so important to get birds out there in the media for all the right reasons. And you've given plenty of examples of that tonight, Keith. It's been a real privilege. Thanks ever so much on behalf of us all for giving us a real taste of the South. We're absolutely indebted to you, and look forward to keeping in touch through the Bird Group Forum as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.